Good evening, everyone. Let me welcome you to this Zoom space and this workshop. It's one of three that's being offered in the evenings by the Penn Central Conference as part of the annual meeting. And the theme this year is Renewing the Covenant We Share. And it's totally based on a Bible verse out of Ecclesiastes, chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. That says, two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. So I think that's a great verse. So hopefully we'll help each other up. By the way of introduction, my name is Joanne Carroll, and I am one of the members of the Penn Central Conference Open and Affirming Ministry team. I represent the Lancaster Association, and I am a member of Christ Church in Elizabethtown, and I am the consistory president. Now, I'm compelled to tell you that this Zoom session is being recorded. So, because if you look in that upper left-hand corner, you'll see a little note. It says it's being recorded. So if you want to come back and refer to this later, you can, because the link will be on the Penn Central website. So before we really get started, let me pray with you. Most gracious and holy God, make your presence be known to us as we seek to further the community of faith. Strengthen our own resolve to meet the challenges faced by the marginalized among us. Incline your ear to us and grant us your peace. In the name of the Christ. Amen. So we'll dive right into it. The title for tonight is Protecting Trans and Non-Binary Youth, or the subtitle is Two Dads Talk About Faith, Gender Affirming Care, Bathrooms, and Athletic Participation. And certainly it's a timely conversation in light of the efforts by the draconian extremists across the country that are doing everything they can to target the LGBT community. Now, your questions are certainly welcome. I'm not going to speak for Tom or Dietmar on whether or not they want to be interrupted while we're speaking, but that's up to them to clarify that when they begin. But there will be hopefully enough time at the end of our session that we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So all of you on the Zoom should have received an email, or a couple of emails actually, giving the bios of our two speakers tonight. So in order to preserve time, I'm not going to bore you with reading them, because otherwise it becomes more like a eulogy, and they're both alive, so we don't need to do that. But these two presenting fathers I've known for years, and I'm proud to call them my friends. And so, hi guys, welcome to the space.
Wonderful to be here.
No, thank you. I'm glad you are. In the background, managing the tech things, if you've signed on a little earlier, you realize that Alyssa Boyer is our host, and she's our tech geek for the night. So Alyssa, thank you so much for helping us out, and welcome. So let's begin. As we agreed to before, Dietmar, you're first, so I'll just let you take off.
Yes, welcome to all of you. I appreciate you taking the time and continuing the learning process. I see myself as a learner in the process of being also an advocate. Just a little bit about my personal story. Our son Felix came out when he was 21. So he was not here in school in Selinsgrove yet anymore, but he was in college already. And it has been quite a journey for us as parents to learn, to adjust, to welcome him, to embrace him. So it was an ongoing process. And when I look back, I think it took us about 2 years for us to process and be with him. So it started with struggling with us with pronouns. How do we use the right pronouns? Being together with him and selecting new names, name changes. So all of this happened while he was already in college. And that made it easier than had it been here in our local school district. That's one thing. Since he came out and we went through the transition together with him, since then we started a PFLAG group here in the area. That is, we're hosting that as a congregation, which is an amazing group of people who support and advocate and as allies of the LGBTQ plus community. And through that, I've been meeting with other people and other parents we're fighting the good fight here in the local school district. So we have had matters of bathroom use. We have had big contentious school board meetings some years back, and where and how that is all, what is okay, what is not okay, what is legally allowed, what is not legally allowed. So we're in a gray zone. And I'm very proud to say that the community really rallied around several of the trans students and for their parents, and supported them wholeheartedly here in Selinsgrove. Two things that really matter to me as we have conversations about or about legislation and all. So the two things that matter to me is, one, the affirming of trans or any and all LGBTQ plus people. To me, it's always a matter of love. Do we really love people for who they are? So to me, it's not a political thing. It becomes that too, the advocacy. But it comes back for me to the deep, basic covenant of faith. Do we love this person for who that person is? And the second statement is justice. For me, is what love looks like in the public square. So if we really mean that we love a person for who they are, we also stand with them and advocate for justice, for fairness, for inclusion. So those are my this far for the beginning. So any question now, anything, or do we, what's next?
I'll just move on with Tom. Tom, it's your turn. Let's go.
Yep.
All right.
I forgot I was on mute. I tried to coach you to do it a minute ago and it didn't work.
All right. Let me just pull my stuff up here. All right. Can you all see my slides? And you can hear my voice. Yes.
Yes.
We're doing good then. So thank you so much for that personal reflection. I have a very similar story. I'm a doctor, which I feel like made my journey a little bit more complicated because I thought I knew everything there was to know about human condition. And yeah, my kid came out and said, hey, you know, I'm a different gender than you thought. And that was about, boy, it's probably been about 8 years ago. And that was something that I wasn't ready for. And we spent a lot of time learning about all things LGBTQ. And it's been a fantastic journey. And I made so many friends. I've learned so many things. And I've clarified so much where I needed to be as a person, as a dad, and as and an ally to the LGBTQ community, and my faith and my work, and you know, just so many things. And I think up until that time, you know, I was still kind of trying to figure it out, like what's the right way to feel about all this LGBTQ stuff. And but once you got skin in the game, you know, you really have to kind of figure out like how are you gonna live, and what does it mean to be affirming? You know, how do you create a safe space for your family? So anyway, I put together a slide deck. I wanted to talk to you about what the science has to say about this topic that has become so pervasive in society today. This question of, you know, athletic participation and trans kids, and you know, so many states are railing against trans people in general, and like, where is this coming from? And you know, is there something that we can do about it? And it really is kind of sums up very nicely in this title of genitalia, gender, genes, gym class, and Jesus. And I had to put Jesus on there because, well, Jesus starts with G also. And I had a bunch of G's in a row. So I figured I'd just add it on there at the end. So I hope you find that humorous. I made me smile. I hope it does for you as well. I am happy for you to interrupt me at any time. If you want to raise your hand, or hopefully I can see the chat. I don't know if I can or not, but if not, then just unmute and start talking. So the question that I'll pose to get started is, can science resolve the questions of gender identity and athletic participation and gender affirming care and bathrooms and faith? And what about genitalia and genes and gender? And, what does science have to say? Before we get into that, I wanted to share with you a Gallup poll, and this is pretty recent. As of 2021, 7.1% of the population at large identifies as something other than heterosexual. All right, so LGBT or Q, I, A, S, 2, P plus. There's a lot of different letters in this acronym, but it's important to recognize that more people are identifying as being part of this this community. And I think it's important for us as faith leaders to realize that when we approach a congregation, when we approach society, when we approach growth or the community, that 7% of the people that we're trying to reach out to identify the LGBTQ spectrum somewhere. And this issue is clarified further by generation. Traditionalists identify just under 1%. The baby boomers, 46 to 1964, 2.6% identify as LGBT. Gen X, that's my generation, 1965 to 1980, 4.2%. Millennials climb up to 10.5%. And Generation Z, which is 1993 and on, is logging at 20.8%. So if you are building a youth program today, 1 in 5 of the kids sitting around that table have considered issues sincerely about LGBTQ, the LGBTQ spectrum for themselves. I would go further than that to say 100% have been in conversation about LGBTQ issues in general. Now, when you break that down, 14% will identify, that 21% or the 7% of the population at large will identify as lesbian, 21% gay, 10% trans, other 4.3, and a whopping 57% will identify as bisexual. So that's kind of the foundation that we're launching from. And I think when we talk about trans issues and state laws that are coming out that are alienating trans people from public spaces, we need to realize that this is not just affecting 1% of the population. This is potentially affecting 21% of Generation Z. That is huge. And so what does this mean? Well, let's talk about more questions about what does it mean to be non-binary. Well, in 2022, is a Pew Research poll which concluded that 5.1% of young adults between the ages of 18 and 29 identified as either trans or non-binary. So, like I said before, we once thought that being trans was something like 1% of the population. But this non-binary, not exactly, female, not exactly male, gender fluid, gender queer, whatever language you want to use to talk about that issue, that continuum, the numbers are higher than we used to think. Now, there's been a couple big studies that have really settled the science on the topic of gender-affirming hormone therapy. It's shocking to me that some of these state legislatures have come out and said that we should make it illegal to provide gender-affirming hormone care because it is frankly harmful. It is the way to destroy lives. It is the way to harm people, and it will cause deaths. It will cause morbidity. But the conclusion of this study, and this was the New England Journal of Medicine, January of this year, 2023. This is very recent. Gender affirming hormone therapy significantly reduces symptoms of anxiety and depression, significantly improves appearance, congruence, life satisfaction, and positive effect. And it's very important to say that gender affirming hormone therapy alone is insufficient to prevent all health risks faced by gender minority patients. So there's a lot more to this than just getting the hormones right. One of the things that folks don't always appreciate is that gender affirming hormone therapy is not always permanent. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, in the very beginning, when a child is coming into puberty and they're questioning their gender or having a conversation about gender, you can use things like puberty blockers to put puberty off a bit, and you can engage in a counseling relationship. You can have a conversation with your kid. You can do what we did, which is read a bunch of books about, gender identity, and you can figure it out, and you can make a decision about where are we headed with this. And the answer is you got to talk to your kid, because like the kid is the one that knows whether or not they're male, female, non-binary, queer, whatever the thing is. And there's no test. I'm going to save you a little bit of trouble here. I don't have the answer. The kid is the one that has the answer. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was this issue of social determinants of health. I have listed here a bunch of different areas that finance, food, access to medical care, unhealthy environments, criminal justice, violence, immigration, transportation, education, discrimination. Clearly, every one of those things could justify an hour of conversation. And when you begin to stack them on top of each other, the impact that it has on individuals is logarithmically worse. It's not linear, right? It's not like 1 + 1 = 1 bad thing plus 2 bad things equals, 3 bad things. We used to think that HIV was a punishment, right? Punishment for, this insufficient personal responsibility, right? So gay men, they got their due, right? They got HIV as a consequence because they, didn't have, control over their behavior. Well, over the next 20 years, we've learned a whole lot about HIV. And what we've learned is that HIV is actually a proxy for privilege in the United States. So HIV goes where social determinants of health go. HIV follows. And, when we talk about HIV rates, they illuminate the mechanisms by which societies decide, fundamentally whose lives matter, right? Whose lives matter. And so when we build these policies and these laws that exclude or marginalize certain populations, they affect health. So when we say, hey, you can't participate in athletics, or, hey, you can't go to the bathroom, just really silly stuff, but very impactful for the person who can't go to the bathroom. What you end up with is a world where it's just not safe to live. And so, as these laws are built to marginalize this very large group of people, what we end up with is a reality that we're facing right now. And I am sorry, I'm trying to get this thing out of the way. So I wonder if I can just get it on. Hey, yeah, okay, I can do that. Just get it off the screen altogether. Yeah, so for the first time, this is a quote from CNN today. For the first time in its 4-decade history, America's largest lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer civil rights organization, otherwise known as the Human Rights Coalition, HRC, has declared a national state of emergency for members of the LGBTQ plus community. The Human Rights Campaign said on Tuesday, and that Tuesday would be this Tuesday. We are in an inflection point in our society where legislatures have boldly gone where they've actually never gone before. There were bad things happening back in the 50s. Absolutely. People were being fired and being rooted out and being prosecuted. But this is on really another level. These are states that are enacting anti-LGBTQ bills that are in effect restricting access to gender affirming care. So restricting access to healthcare, to physicians, restricting participation in gender-based sports to, their birth sex. And we'll talk more about that word birth sex as if it's known with certainty at any time. Restricting the use of gender-based bathrooms to birth sex, requiring mandated reports of LGBTQ plus identity to parents. So forcibly outing kids when it may not be safe to do so. Preventing or restricting the discussion of LGBTQ plus topics in educational curricula. And the last is the vast majority of these bills fail to pass or die in committee, but some become law. And so, the ACLU is very much aware of this, and they're doing everything they can to protect the rights of these marginalized individuals. But unfortunately, some of these laws are making it through. I wanted to talk a little bit about, how it is that the social determinants of health and these laws, like how do they affect us? We all know that people who have a lot of social determinants of health in their history have more diabetes, more hypertension, more heart disease, more strokes. But the question is why? And one of the answers is this concept of epigenetics. Epigenetics is a recent area of study where, so our DNA is like, the fingerprint of who we are. And then there's these proteins that come along and decode the DNA, and they express different aspects of our body's function. And epigenetics tells us that we can change the way our DNA is expressed. So if you can imagine, if you sit in a polluted space, that pollution will have a negative impact on your body. It will change the way your DNA is expressed, and it will change the way your body functions. Now, the thing about this is that when epigenetics goes into effect, that epigenetic change can actually be passed on to children and their children as if it was being inherited. All right, so these changes that come from the environment become heritable. So you can understand why it is that, folks that came up through slavery, Black folks that came up as slaves, 100 or 200 years later, are still experiencing worse health outcomes, in part because of epigenetics. And that is what's happening right now to our trans kids, to our LGBTQ plus kids, and all these issues around exercise, diet, smoking, alcohol, racism, and trauma in general, right? The big umbrella of trauma can be passed on from us to our kids. So there's this, the personal responsibility theory, right? It's I've very colloquially referred to it in this way. If you weren't such a loser, you wouldn't be such a loser, right? It's the idea that if you could just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, everything would be fine. So the personal responsibility theory would say, the reason you had HIV was because you had a personality flaw. Well, we all know that, if you have this personality flaw, then, you're deserving of this deadly punishment, which is HIV. And that was a very prevalent, position that was levied against the LGBTQ community for many, many years, and still is in some circles. Certainly not this circle, but some. What we have come to learn is that these marginalized communities, Black communities, gay communities, they're actually more likely to use protection than white heterosexual counterparts. They're more likely to abstain from sexual intercourse. They're more likely to avoid high-risk activities that would put them at risk for HIV because they fundamentally understand that they're at high risk of contracting these diseases and they don't want it. So the reason that marginalized communities have more HIV is because there's more HIV in the community. You can't catch COVID if nobody in the room has COVID. It's not a personality flaw, it's infectious disease. So the personal responsibility theory is really just a bunch of crap. So talking about structural stigma, that is the stuff that we build into laws, institutional policies. They are the attitudes that the public carries with them. And they are practices that limit opportunities, that limit resources, and ultimately limit well-being. When back in the 50s, a local swimming pool got closed to keep the Black kids out, well, the white kids didn't get to swim either, right? Closing the pool hurt the whole community. So these constructs lead to minority stress. It adversely affects health, adversely impacts well-being. And then this word that's become a buzzword, intersectionality, which by the way, has been around now for about 40 years. Intersectionality is this idea that, it's one thing to be Black, it's another thing to be trans, it's another thing to be female. But when you're Black, trans, and female, the intersection of those three things causes your risk to multiply by multiple factors. So multiple forms of systemic marginalization produce substantially negative social, economic, physical, and mental health outcomes. And what it really comes down to is this: unhealthy spaces produce unhealthy people. If you want to produce healthy people, make the space they live in healthy. Remove the toxic stuff. There's so many good reasons to, whether it's literally making the air quality better, but in this case, making laws that build people up instead of tearing them down. One of the things we know is that stigma is a fundamental cause of population health inequities. So, if we got to build the structure into our society that promotes well-being. So what about sex versus gender? Well, sex assigned at birth. Sex is assigned at birth. And we all know, right, that you can look at somebody's genitalia and figure out their sex. Well, maybe, maybe not. And I would say the answer is about 95% of the time, you can look between a child's legs and you can learn something about them. But 5% of the time, you're going to get misled. And so we make that first swipe at birth and we say, okay, well, you are a boy, you are a girl, therefore you fit into these masculine or feminine gender roles. And, it works for a lot of people, but it doesn't work for all, and it may not even work for many. And the exceptions are just so numerous that it really makes you wonder why we continue to hold on to a paradigm that forces people into one club or the other. And so there's this whole continuum understanding of sex and gender identity and gender expression and sexual orientation. And, I think anybody who comes along and tries to tell you that, well, hey, there was a time in the past when everybody fit neatly into the male category or the female category, what they're really saying is that, freedom of expression was being suppressed, right? So we chose your gender, we, society, chose your gender role, and you didn't actually have much of a say in it. So that was the way that this whole gender continuum was resolved. So today, folks don't want to put up with that anymore. So what about genes? We've talked a bit about DNA, but genotype versus phenotype. So genes are the DNA that we have in our body. The phenotype is the expression of those genes. So if I have a gene for, say, blonde hair, then I have blonde looking hair. If I have a gene for, light colored skin, then I would have a phenotype of, light colored skin. Unfortunately, genes do not solve the gender question. For that 5% of people that you swipe their, 26andMe genes, unfortunately, you don't get the answer about gender. There's so many exceptions to the 46XX and 46XY rule that unfortunately checking genes is not a solution. So we have, as an example, you can get genes from an individual, and there are many phenotypic females, a phenotype being expressing as female. And then you find that they have 46XY chromosomes, 46XY, XY being the male version of chromosomes. But the Y might be dysfunctional, or the receptors that receive Y expression might be null. And so as a result, you end up with this phenotypic female with XY or male chromosomes. There's, as you know, mom passes on 23, dad passes on 23, and you get 46 chromosomes. One pairing is the sex chromosome, and I don't want to hear anything about how the X is bigger, stronger, and fatter than the Y, but that's just the way it is. But yes, so 46XX is traditionally assigned to females, phenotypic females, and 46XY is assigned to phenotypic males. So what about these genes? Why don't we just use them to resolve our questions around participation in athletics? Well, the problem is, and I'll just kind of jump to the bottom of the slide, of the 4,600 women who competed in the 2012 Summer Olympic Games in London, there were 32 women athletes that had 46XY genotype. So, what are we supposed to do with that information? These are, female assigned at birth. They've been living their lives as female. They didn't know they had 46XY, and it wasn't until the people that were doing the Olympics did the study. It was actually a very handy study back in 2012. And it also points out that the elite professional athletic organizations of the world have been struggling with issues around gender for a very long time. This is nothing new to athletic organizations. It has only been within the last, 3 years that society has realized that, hey, we can push votes one way or another. Let's make this into a big issue, and let's see if we can drive some of these people who are on the fence, our way. Well, so isn't gender biologic? So there are individuals with this developmental sex disorder who were genetically 46XY, but they were born without a penis. In the past, what we usually had done is just surgically reassign them to females. In other words, remove the phallus and then raise them as females. Unfortunately, 20 to 50% of those raised as female said, you got it wrong. I want to be male. And it tells us that it's not just about, biology. There's this gravitational sense of, gender that lives within each one of us. This last reference here is a really interesting study where they looked at trans kids, and there were identical twins and there were fraternal twins, right? So fraternal meaning 2 separate sperm and 2 separate eggs, both getting fertilized at the same time and implanting about the same time, and then getting raised at the same time, as opposed to identical twins, 2 separate sperm fertilizing the same egg, and then that egg splits into 2 beings. 40% of those identical twins, if one was trans, the other would be trans 40% of the time. Now, if they were fraternal, meaning 2 separate eggs, and one was trans, 0% of their siblings of their twin siblings were trans. So clearly there is a biological component of, this gender identity. And if you are identical twins, there's a very high probability that your sibling will have a similar gender identity. So about hormone exposure, children that were born with this 46XY genotype who either did not have enough testosterone or do not have a testosterone receptor, they can present as male, female, or something in between. There are many forces working together, including chromosomes, hormones, receptors, that give us this thing called gender and gender identity. We've talked a bit about mental health. I'm going to take just a second here. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything in the chats. Okay, I think we're in good shape. Yeah, so mental health. These are sad numbers, and as a parent, when you have a trans kid and you start reading these numbers, you start to get really anxious. I can tell you it's very deeply disturbing. But 50% of trans and non-binary youth consider suicide. And 14% attempted in 2022. So these are recent numbers and they're staggering. Anxiety and depression both improve with regular exercise and sport. I look at exercise as being like food. You need it. It doesn't mean that you have to run a marathon to be exercising. You just need to get up and move. And if you can't get up, you just move. But it is part of being our best, and which is to be active. And the International Olympic Committee has made the statement that the practice of sport is a human right. And that human right is being revoked by some. So I put a picture up here of the non-binary Yeti. Well, you see there are many out there that would try to tell us that there are men that are masquerading as women so they can gain a competitive advantage and they can be, successful in sports. Well, as it turns out, gender fraud in sports is an urban legend. It doesn't exist. There are exactly 0 examples of men posing as women to gain competitive advantage in athletics. On the other hand, in history, there have been multiple legitimate examples of women pretending to be men in order to gain access to sports previously closed to women. This is one of those examples of if you say something false often enough, it can become true. I love this picture. This is Catherine Switzer in 1964. She was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon. And in this image, the person that took the photo snapped it at just the right time. She was running along with her male colleagues or counterparts. And the guy directly behind her that's physically assaulting her was the race owner, organizer. He was an Irish guy that was running down the road, probably out of breath, trying to catch up with her, trying to pull her numbers off of her shirt to disqualify her from the race. And you can see these 2 burly guys behind Catherine coming along and pushing him off of her to allow her to continue to run. And that picture, that photo, has made its way around the globe and has made 261. Those numbers have lived on in infamy, and Catherine Switzer has been a celebrated part of the Boston Marathon. Even to this day, she's in her 80s, and she's still running the Boston Marathon, and probably will until she can't do it anymore. I think you understand.
Can I interrupt
Oh,
you
yes,
real quick?
please.
Sorry to bother you.
Yes.
But we do have a question in the chat from Reverend Kathy, who would like to know, do you know what percentage of trans and non-binary youth completed suicide?
Not off the top of my head. I know that it was 14% have attempted, 50% have considered, and I don't know the answer of how many times it was completed.
Thank you for we saw that question, so thanks for taking that. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. So why all the rhetoric? Well, so this is a quote from PBS NewsHour, and this is not my opinion. It was the opinion of the person that was speaking at the time. But what they said was Republicans need evangelicals to get elected. And this trans fight gets them stirred up. It gets their attention. And if they're not talking about abortion, actually, it turns out abortion is increasingly a toxic issue for conservatives. Gay marriage is something that independents really support. So, you know, that's been a kind of a fail. So what are we left with? Well, I'm sure we'll come up with something after the trans kids, but for now it's the trans kids. So they're going after trans kids to rile up the base and try to preserve power. It's really what it comes down to, is people who are in power wanting to stay in power. This is a picture of Leah Thomas. Leah Thomas was the swimmer at University of Pennsylvania that is trans and was doing well as a swimmer. And the question appropriately comes up is, you know, is there a problem? Is there a problem with trans kids competing in sports, particularly trans women? And what we know is that testosterone will give you a little competitive advantage, not a big one, but you get about a 1 to 3% athletic advantage. Now, if you're running a 400 meter, if you know anything about running, people win or lose on fractions of a second. So taking testosterone, if it gave you a 1% advantage, would be substantial. That would perhaps make you a winner. Being male versus female gives you about a 10 to 12% advantage. So that's pretty significant. So you would think that male assigned at birth transitioning to female and competing in sports would be an unfair advantage. There is a lot of other stuff that happens that's called practice, working hard, sleeping well, and getting good nutrition and good coaching, and, you know, building up your VO2 max and some other genetic and biologic variations that make up, you know, true competition. You know, what Leah said when asked later is when she transitioned and started taking estrogen, she lost quite a bit of muscle mass. She was no longer nearly as fast of a swimmer as she was when she was competing with the boys. And what she found was that she, you know, was a competitive swimmer nonetheless with the females, but she was nowhere near as fast of a swimmer as she was when she was competing with the boys. So those changes happened very quickly. She remarked that she was feeling a lot better mentally. She was less depressed. You know, trans people do not transition for athletics, right? They transition because they want to be happy. They want to be authentic. They want to be their true selves. All this discussion about how they're going to, you know, win the next race and be trans in the process is just irrational. It's way too much work. Nobody's going to work that hard for, you know, to win their high school athletic competition. So what is the answer? There's got to be an answer. If science doesn't have the answer, what is the answer? Regulating gender in sports based on science is impossible. You can't do it. There is no way to always differentiate male from female, and we have never possessed the ability to do so. The term biologic sex is meaningless. This concept of female assigned at birth or male assigned at birth really leaves me kind of empty. I know that those words are used and they're very common in medical conversations, and, you know, even the legal world, you know, what was your sex assigned at birth so we can figure you out? Well, you're not really figuring much out. You've got to ask the individual, what is your gender? And then as a doctor, I got to ask, you know, the next question was, what organs do you have and what are we worried about? We've got to make our peace with the fact that there are women out there who get prostate cancer, and there are men out there who get breast cancer. You know, it should be, that's the right answer, and kind of getting away from this, you know, well, what did they think you were when you were a baby? You know, all this stuff about gender and genitalia and genes, they all have exceptions. There used to be naked parades back pre-World War II where they'd take all the female athletes and strip them and make them walk in front of the judges, and they'd make a decision about who was female and who was male. We talked about the chromosome swabs. They didn't work. And basically what it came down to is the only reason this all worked in the past was because, if you weren't male, you didn't participate. So what the World Athletics regulation has done is, as of March of 2023, athletes who have gone through male puberty may not participate in female world ranking competitions. So if you transition after the age of about 12, you're going to be excluded. World Aquatics, male to female athletes will only be eligible to compete in the women's category if they transition before age 12 or before they reach Tanner stage 2, which is about that same age. Anyone who has gone through male puberty retains male anatomical differences that provide an athletic advantage. That's World Athletics. And there is no direct or consistent research which concludes that trans athletes have an advantage. So, well, right now there aren't any trans people participating in athletics at all, so it's going to be hard to do that study. But, I think, one of the things we know is that social science tells us the stigma doesn't just go away. This is, unfortunately, we're in this for a generation. I hope I'm wrong. I really do. It takes a concerted and proactive effort with activism across levels. What we are doing right now is we are learning about LGBTQ issues, and we are once again galvanizing our decision to create gay affirming and queer affirming spaces to worship and to express religion and to get closer to God. Permitting legalized stigmatization in public places gives a green light to private stigmatization, leading to worse health outcomes. So this stuff really matters. When they write these laws, trust me, there are going to be people that take this stuff to heart, and they're going to physically assault LGBTQ folks, believing that they're doing the right thing. Creating spaces in which LGBTQ plus individuals can participate fully in society and lead dignified lives will produce healthy, independent people. So this is my last slide. Unfortunately, science cannot answer the question of gender. Inclusion at all levels for all humans is a fundamental human right. The evidence does not support placing restrictions on male to female athletic participation, and a longitudinal approach to male to female athletic participation probably makes the most sense. So that's where we are. I hope I've answered all your questions. If you're interested, I have a bunch of references here. That is the end of my slideshow. Let me see if I can stop sharing. There we go.
If I may
Yeah.
interrupt you, Tom, one of
Yeah,
the
go ahead.
advantages that I have of being the host of this thing is I get to butt in.
Yeah.
And Tom's really given you a pretty good primer on what science looks at in terms of the trans community. As a woman who is a person of trans experience, I can tell you a couple of things. One is, if you use his scientific argument with somebody, understand this: if they're a biblical literalist, you're really up for a challenge. And I'll tell you why. Because they don't accept science. And the reason they don't accept science is because all of a sudden their creation theories go away. Because you can't prove that the earth was built in 6,000 years if everything in science says it was billions of years of age. And the other thing is the reason that LGBT is being picked on so much, and one of your slides picked it up, Tom, and that is that no longer is the issue on same-sex marriage. In fact, we went from like 56% approval to about a 70% approval. And in terms of the other issue, it's jumped even higher than that on Roe v. Wade's kickback on the Dodd decision. And what it boils down to is it's tribalism. And I don't know if you know anything about tribalism, but tribalism is, in order for a tribe to stay together, the leader of the tribe has to give them some common enemy to hate to keep them rallied around a cause. And so without gay marriage, without abortion, all of a sudden the low-hanging fruit becomes LGBT community, and even the more low-hanging fruit, no pun intended at all in any of that, becomes the trans community. And so we're easily targeted because number one, we don't have money to fight back. Most trans people try to live off of $10,000 a year or less, believe that or not. So again, Tom, thanks for your scholarly outlook. I hope you don't mind me adding those couple of comments. So
No, absolutely, of course.
so we're open for questions. So if you have one, raise your hand or hit the little thingy down in the chat line or whatever you want, and we'll be happy to. But don't speak until I recognize you, please. Oh, we're hearing crickets. Well, if you're going to be at an impasse, I'm going to tell you one more thing, and that is transition is kind of governed a little bit by the world. I can't think, WPATH, World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And there's 4 pieces to the transition puzzle. First one is social. In other words, the individual has to all of a sudden decide that there are differences about what their assigned gender is compared to what they know they are. And they start going out socially as in life as that gender that they know they are. The second one is legal, because obviously in order to function, you have to have documentation, driver's licenses, birth certificates, different pieces of paper that tell people who you are. Then you have medical, which is hormone therapy. And then finally, way at the end of the line is surgical. And I would tell you that 80% of the community never sees surgery. And the reason for it is they can't afford it. Or they're too afraid of how they're going to be treated by a medical professional. Christine, yeah, I see your hand. Please speak up.
Well, I've gone through all this as a trans woman. What I'm finding out with people that know me is that the misinformation is really bad as far as people are saying, oh yeah, they're going to change these kids' gender when they're young before they even get a chance to. And I try to explain to people that you just can't check into a room and say, okay, I want to change my gender. It takes years of therapy. And, you know, it just doesn't happen overnight. I wish they would have had hormone blockers when I was growing up, because, you know, even though I'm over 6 foot tall and I have to work hard to pass, I have a pretty good life. I transitioned in 2011. I've held jobs. I was a manager for UPS. When I was at UPS, my therapist at Johns Hopkins wanted me to come out then, but I was too much of a coward. Well, because you know, UPS was kind of a testosterone-driven company, and I didn't think they'd take me seriously. But after I retired, they asked HR people to come back, and I came back as Christine, and the welcome I received was unbelievable. Well, also, what I wanted to say is to younger people, this is not a big issue, because I have a presentation that I've given. In fact, I gave it at the conference a couple of years ago, more like 6 years ago now. And I've done it at several places, in churches, and I was at the Millersville University. There's 200 students in Millersville. I showed my slideshow and told them my story and told them, you know, how it is. And when they introduced me, I'm also a playwright, and I won an award once. So they introduced me as an award-winning playwright, which was a stretch, but so most of the kids, after I've listened to the 45-minute presentation, said, can we talk about playwriting now? There was only one girl in the back that couldn't get her head around it with her religion. You know, she was too much into you know, your male and female role. She had a tough time, but the other kids were just, they wanted to know something different. Like it just didn't matter to them at all. And I think in sports it's like this too, particularly with high school sports. I just had a letter published in the Lancaster newspaper recently, and my argument for transgender sports is sports itself is inherently unfair. You know, is it fair that Aaron Judge gets to play against people who are not as good as he is? You know, there were baseball players. You know, I could think of Larry Bowa, who didn't have a whole lot of talent. He had to work twice as hard as Mike Schmidt. So sports itself is, and I think also, particularly in the high school level, we become obsessed with winning. Winning is the only thing that matters anymore. So anyway, those are my comments.
Thank you, Christine.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? I'm sure most of you are of an age where you heard of Renee Richards. Renee Richards was an ophthalmologist named Richard Raskin. And when she transitioned, she changed her name to Renee Richards. And she wanted to join the Women's Professional Tennis Association. And there was a hue and a cry that went up like you wouldn't believe. Oh no, it's unfair. It's just terrible. Guess what? She finally got into the WPTA and she couldn't even hold up the socks of any of the other girls in that competition. She got her butt kicked every time she went out in competition. She never even placed enough to get to a semifinal. So as far as a physical advantage, she was 6'4", I think it was. Obviously, she would have a heck of a reach, but it didn't pay off. She couldn't win. So. Anybody else? We got about 4 minutes left before we have to call it quits, so we can get a few questions in before that 4 minutes is up. Yeah, Christine.
When I first started this journey, my first therapist was at Johns Hopkins, and he asked me to come in and talk to some students who were in the gender studies area, and I did. And the first year I did it, I asked if anybody knew anybody who was LGBT or whatever, and one person raised their hand. 10 years later, I've been doing it every year for 10 years. The last time I went, half the class raised their hand that they knew somebody. And the thing is, it's just like anything else. If you get to know the people, that's why. I mean, I had a job after I retired from UPS, and this man comes into my office one time, and he's crying, and I said, What's the matter? He goes, I owe you a big apology. I said, why? He says, because you're pleasant to me every day. You give me everything I need to know my job, and I keep calling you sir. And I said, the fact that you recognize that is enough. Because when you first start to transition, every little thing bothers you. You think everybody's laughing at you, you think everybody's watching you, and you find out it really isn't true. After a while, you build your confidence up, and you just you just go on with your life. And people learn by learning what you are. If you go through life and you're transgender and you're quiet all the time, you don't say anything, and you walk, that's when when attention is attracted to you. But if you go out and just participate, my sister-in-law, who's a minister, gave me that lesson. Because when I first transit with my family, my in-laws, I didn't want to be in anybody's face. So I didn't go out. It was a big room. They were all talking. So I just stayed watching TV, and nobody was there. And my sister-in-law came in and she said, why aren't you talking to everybody? I said, well, I don't want to get in anybody's face. She said, no, you're you. Be the same you were before, and they'll forget that. And they did. And I find that to be true. No matter what you look like or what your gender is, you're still the same person you always were. And when people get to know you, whether you're gay or trans or anything, they change their minds about everything. I know I've personally changed a bunch of people's minds who, once they got to know me, said, I'm not the devil they thought I was.
Yeah, amen. We're almost out of time. Keno, is it short? Can we do it?
Oh, we have to, or else I'm.
Keno, go ahead. You had your hand up. Keno, go ahead and unmute. There you go.
All right, yes. I was going to talk about the role of education in this, how about educating the public, like a father who had experiences. And some communities also have had researches for so many years before they came to understand how that is. And what is the role of education and research in a community and public and all that? I just wanted to know some more.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I mean, I think that it is a piece of the puzzle I think we need research that we can stand on to be confident. I tried to, to find that research and present that today. And I think as a scientist and as a physician, we owe it to our patients to speak with authority. And authority comes from research. Education is important. Education comes in so many different forms. I assure you that 20% of Generation Z is educating their parents, their families, and their friends at a rate that will far outpace anything that I could do running from one place to the other, giving a lecture to, a bunch of adults. The internet is disseminating information about LGBTQ issues at a dizzying rate. And there is no law that can stop that from happening. Generation Z is here to stay. In another year or two, they're going to be voting. Or I guess some of them are voting now. And I believe the writing's on the wall. I think that if you want to get on board, you're going to have to, on some level, appeal to an LGBTQ affirming position. If you want to, lead, if you want to, whatever the organization is you're trying to lead, I can tell you that if my organization, which happens to be UPMC, if they were to take an anti-LGBTQ perspective, we would not be able to open our doors. We would not be able to staff our nurses, our physicians. I started lecturing our teams as a healthcare system about 6 or 7 years ago. And I was doing that for two reasons. One was to educate, but I also wanted to test the water. I wanted to see if South Central PA was ready for this. And I wanted to see if I could make a home here. And I was extremely gratified at the warm welcome that I received as I was out there talking about my trans kid or my non-binary kid and talking about my pro-LGBTQ ideas, agenda, and electronic health record. But I think whatever system of people you're trying to lead today, if you want to have a restaurant that's open and stays open, like the stupidest thing you can do right now if you're trying to bake wedding cakes, is to start irritating gay people. Like that is, you're talking about businesses that are operating on a 1% to 2% margin annually, and you're going to go around and start pissing people off. Generation Z, 21% identifies the LGBTQ spectrum. You might as well just close your doors. So anyway, that's my answer.
And to respond to that point myself, one of my other hats is I'm executive director of Trans Advocacy Pennsylvania. It's a Commonwealth-wide advocacy research support organization, the first one of its kind, I think, at least in PA. I'm not sure about the whole country, but nonetheless, one of my jobs is to go out and to try to conduct education for people that request information on how the trans community looks, what it looks like. And of course, in many cases, when they don't see horns and a tail on me, usually that helps. But we do a lot of work on that. In fact, 2 weeks ago, in the 10 days prior, I did 5 of those. So now that COVID's over, we're getting more opportunities to get out there and talk to people. And it's schools, it's churches, it's business organizations, it's even retiree homes. So it's just all kinds of people. As for the research side of it, I can't speak to the scientific side, but I can tell you about the experience side. The National Center for Trans Equality just last year did the trans study. They did one in 2015, but they just did a brand new one in 2022. The results, I think, are supposed to be out like September, October this year, which will give us, again, some idea of what the experience of the trans community is nationwide. because it wasn't just for PA. They'll break it out for us for PA after they've analyzed all the data. But I would tell you in the past for the 2015 study, our results for, as a Commonwealth mirrored pretty much the rest of the country. And it was through that we learned about 40% of the community having suicidal ideations, not just kids, but even though all respondents. We learned about how 80% of the community won't trust a policeman because they're afraid of being mistreated, and other more and more statistics. But the executive summary itself was 40 pages long, and the main study was even bigger than that. But nonetheless, that'll be out this year. And I would tell you that if any of you want to see what that looks like, get a hold of me at some point. Happy to send you the link once it's published. So anyway, that's not the scientific side of it, but that's the experiential side of it.
There's a question in the chat about recommendations for educational resources. The Human Rights Campaign is a wonderful resource for educational material. I personally use it. I have used it regularly over the years, and I would look at them as being kind of the gold standard of educational resource.
Yeah, the National
Alyssa,
Gay Lesbian Resource Center. You got the LGBT Defense Fund. There's any number of organizations and groups out there that do great work. And I think you just go online and say LGBT organizations and pick one and just start reading. I think it'll be great information for you, in addition to what Tom just mentioned to you.
Alyssa, did you have a question?
I just actually wanted to make sure that you saw the question, Alice's question in the chat. So hooray.
And also, if you're looking for other resources, Trans Central PA is an organization that exists in Harrisburg that is a support organization for transgender people. And on their website, they have a fairly extensive resource page. So lists even for local things like finding somebody who's maybe prescribing hormones, somebody who may be doing gender counseling, whatever. There's just a whole variety of people on that page, along with some other resources that would link you to some of those national organizations as well. So transcentralpa.org is the website, or just go Trans Central PA. You can find it through Google, so it's pretty easy. Any other questions?
I have a question. Since so much is fear-based, what is the best approach? Is it to encourage people to get to know someone with trans, or people to get to know someone from the LGBTQ plus spectrum, or what is that's my experience here as we went through the open and affirming process as a congregation. It's kind of, it's so.
Go ahead. Go ahead, dude. Okay,
I'm done. Your turn.
Yeah. If somebody once said it's awfully easy to hate someone whose story you don't know. And so the objective, I think, of all of those of us that are within the trans community, Christine included, and then so myself and so many others, the more people that we can share our story with, and they realize the angst that we've been through just trying to get to an authentic position makes a huge difference. I know I've had the opportunity to preach in Eva's church, and we talked about that there and a couple of other places around the Susquehanna Valley. But when people see me in those situations and realize I'm a live human being, and I don't pose any threat to anybody, and Christine, I'm sure you can speak to the same point, it makes a huge difference. Karen's known me for years. She knows I'm pretty harmless, so anyhow. What's that? Oh, hello. Okay, so anyway, the stories make the difference, Dietmar. That's the secret. And it leads us to and I will talk some more about that toward the end, about giving you a call to action. And the thing is that you all need to know how to stand up and stand out on behalf of the trans people that you know. It's not good enough to sit back and wring your hands and moan and groan about all the crap that's being thrown at us. You got to get in the fight with us. You got to fight for the living. Can't do much for those kids that have passed on, but you can do a hell of a lot for me. You can do a lot for the other people that identify as trans. But get in the fight. Don't be afraid of it. You know, just because some jerk says something negative to you, don't sit there and be a wimp, you know, say, hey, excuse me, but first of all, don't say negative things like that. And the other thing is make damn sure you show up at the polls. There's one big, I can tell you, and I'm a political being because I have a degree in political science. But there's one damn good way we fix the problem. Vote blue no matter who. Preceding was a paid political announcement. Okay.
Go ahead, Alyssa.
Thanks. This is actually a question for Dietmar, for Reverend Plajer. I'm curious if, you know, if somebody were to approach you and they say, you know, Reverend, I don't know what to do. You know, isn't being trans, isn't that sinful? How would you respond to that? What would your pastoral wisdom be for that person?
Oh, generally, my first approach would be to listen and hear what the concern is, what is the fear, what's going on. And then my overall perspective is get to know someone. And I always share my personal story so that they know someone, that I have a trans son that is just beautiful. For someone to see how much I love my son, just for who he is, makes all the difference in the world. And then with the scriptures, that's so interesting because that seemed to be some of the motivating factor. Well, don't our scriptures say this or don't our scriptures say that? And it's so easy to pick specific verses out from the overall scriptures that seem to affirm people's positions, and not to look at what is at the core, at the heart. So when it comes to the Bible, I always say, let's read the Bible through the eyes of Jesus. Do we have a heart? Do we have a core? Do we have a center of our scriptures? And as far as I see, I try to always come back to Jesus and his care and his support and his love for outsiders, for people who struggle, his compassion, his care, and then so many other things fall away when we focus on the core.
Thank you.
I was raised in a very strict Baptist home. So you can imagine the struggle that I faced and all the angst coming up. And it wasn't until a trans friend of mine suggested I read Galatians 5. Because in Galatians 5, it starts talking about how Paul starts talking about how if you want to follow the law, you better follow the whole law. In other words, he's talking about all 613 pieces of the Mosaic law, which means you better not put milk in your meatloaf and all those kind of things. The Bible's not a menu in a Chinese restaurant. You don't get to pick column A, column B. Christ says it to us very, very clearly. Love God, love one another as you would want to be loved. It's that simple. And he says all the law hangs on those two. So when I read that and talked about how Paul goes on, talks about living in the Spirit, I thought, as long as I'm living in the spirit of what Christ teaches, who in the heck can fault me in terms of what my faith system looks like? And that's served me pretty darn well over the time. One of the verses that I quote very often is in the first couple of verses of chapter 9 of the book of John. Excuse me. The disciples are asking Christ about who sinned, the man or his parents, that the man was born blind at birth. And Christ says, no one sinned. This was done that the glory of God might be revealed. And I take that to mean I was born the way I am, so that as a trans woman, I could tell people that I can glorify God and be a trans person at the same time. And I hope I do that. At least that's my guiding principle. So.
Got a couple questions here.
Christine?
Reverend Kathy?
Oh, Kathy was the first, I guess.
Thank you. Not a question, but just a response to what was asked about scripture. And I have found a scripture that fully affirms transgender persons, which is in Genesis chapter 1, which says that God created male and female in God's own image. And the way that I understand that is trans people who embody both male and female are more like or more godlike than I would say those who do not.
Perhaps the closest reference anywhere in scripture is where Jesus talks about eunuchs. That may be the closest reference beyond all the rest of them, whether it means wearing pants or skirts or whatever else out of Deuteronomy 22. That may be the best reference you have. Some are that way because that was natural, and some are made that way. So, and Christine, you had your hand up.
I think somebody else does first, though.
Okay. Please wiggle your hand so we know which one who it was.
Reverend Catherine, you have your hand up.
Well, I did speak, and I'm not sure how to put my hand back down
Just
again.
go
So
back down
somebody.
to reactions and it tells you how to do it.
All right, thank you.
What I was going to say was that the very first therapist I had, you know, the way I broke into her, I told her I have this problem. And what she told me, I've used in other people too. And she said, stop calling your problem and call it your gift. And that changes everything. Because even if you look in history, Native Americans, this is nothing new. Native Americans had transgender members of their tribes. They called them two spirits, and they were considered holy. I told my sister-in-law once that. She said, "No, that mean we have to bow down to you now?" But that never happened. But anyway, that you know, by looking at it a different way, it really helped me grasp. You know, because sometimes therapists will send me people who are just starting out and they're having trouble with their parents. They don't know how to say it and stuff. You know, but think of it as your gift.
What can we say about the guy that was seen carrying a pitcher of water on his head? That's written in the New Testament as a thing. Fetching water was a female task. And what about Joan of Arc? What was she? That's not biblical, but that's okay. I had to go there. Karen, were you getting ready to say something?
Yeah, I was just thinking about last Sunday when some of us dealt with the Trinity and with the first chapter of Genesis. And the fact that, you know, repeatedly we were all created in God's image. And yet when you look at God in terms of the Trinity and the fact that all three of those parts of the Godhead, I use my Southern Baptist language, were different. And yet they cover the spectrum of people, of human beings. And they also show us how to live together and how to relate to each other and how to self-efface and lift each other. I mean, it's the whole score of how we are to be. And who's to say? I mean, I love the fact that if I'm gay, that's the gay part of God that's in me. If I'm non-binary, that's the non-binary part of God that's in me. Because God isn't limited. And I'm preaching, so I'm going to shut up. But just the whole idea that we all carry a portion of God. And I know you all believe that, but try to tell that to somebody that doesn't believe it. Like some of my family members.
Pastor
You know,
of First Baptist Church in Dallas.
Somebody had asked.
Jeffers, oh
Yeah.
my gosh.
What, that's okay. We'll leave him alone. There's two,
Yep.
that's low hanging fruit from our perspective.
Certainly. is.
Somebody had asked about advocacy, and I just want to say June is Pride Month,
Amen.
and a wonderful form of advocacy is just sticking a rainbow flag out in your front yard. Insofar as you're comfortable doing so. If you have a name badge at work, put a little rainbow, whatever ornament on your name badge. I've been wearing one for years, and I've lost track of the number of times that staff, colleagues, patients will ask, why are you wearing that? And I tell them because, I'm an ally to the LGBTQ community and it's important to me. And, that statement, especially coming out of a, middle-aged, straight white guy's mouth, they're like, what? Oh, you too? I'm like, you betcha. And, I think it really carries some weight. It's a little act of affirmation to put that little rainbow flag out the front yard or on the lapel or, or a sticker on the back of your car. You never know who's going to see that. You don't know who's having a terrible day today, and suddenly they get lifted up because of that little sticker on the back of their car. You may never know who you touch, or you might, but it matters. It makes a difference. And I can tell you, in the world that we live in right now, where people are going so far out of their way to be toxic on this topic, it matters more than ever.
If you're looking for a real wonderful opportunity, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but every year the Penn Central O&A team has a booth at the Harrisburg Pride Celebration. And we're always looking for those of y'all that are part of Penn Central to stop in and spend some time shaking hands and greeting people within the community and those who stop by just for information. Because it's imperative, I would tell you, that people realize that there's a Christian community that totally embraces people in the LGBT community. And you can make a huge difference. And if you really want to be more active than that, the Silent Witness Peacekeepers are looking for people to hold the umbrellas at Harrisburg because they don't have enough folks. So if you need to get in touch with some of those people, I can connect you with that too. But go to a Pride event, see what's going on. Don't stay away from it. Go to one of the big ones. Go to the one in Lancaster if you're in Lancaster. Go to Harrisburg. Go to York. Go to Carlisle's even. Every community is now starting to have Pride celebrations. Praise God. So. Am I right, Steve, that they're going to have another one this year?
Yes. Yep. I'll be sending out information in the next week or so. I'm actually going to be in Lewisburg a week from Saturday to be at their first Pride event, and I'm looking forward to that. And so yeah, look for more information. But if your community is having a Pride event, please be there for us.
Yeah.
And that.
I'll be in York and Carlisle next
Steve,
week.
is that this coming Saturday?
No, it's the 18th. I'm sorry, it's the 17th. 17th is Lewisburg.
I might want to go with you.
Eva's got her hand up. Eva, go ahead. You'll have to.
I'm working on it here.
There you go.
Well, and York is doing theirs this weekend.
Yep.
It'll be at the York Fair, but this year is the first time that UCC and Lutheran clergy are going together, and we are doing an interfaith service the night before Pride at Counselor Park, which is where Pride was held last year, and they tried to stop Pride from happening there last year. So some clergy got together and we decided that there should be an interfaith service, and we've invited the Jewish faith and Muslims and the Baha'i, and so we're all going together and doing an interfaith service the night before Pride. So balance that with annual meeting. I have to leave annual meeting on Friday night so I can be at an interfaith service. So
First Reformed is having a Pride Sunday on the 25th, and they made the mistake of asking me to come and preach. So that ought to be an interesting time. That used to be my old church. So. What else we got? We got a few
I-
more minutes.
I also want to say, it's just so important to do the education. Becoming an O&A church, Dover, one of the things I'm really proud that Dover has done has been to consistently educate not only on gay and lesbian issues, but we did a whole curriculum on transgendered in the first year after the church became O&A. We've done curriculum on socioeconomic issues, on racism. We've done several studies on racism, and I just think it's really important. And we had so much fun when Alyssa shared her her queering study of the Bible, and our folks just ate that up. They loved it. And we had somebody coming from another church because they just wanted to know what that was about. And really enjoyed it. So I'll never forget when I first came into UCC, I was finishing an interim at Hayshire, and there were some transgender folk who knew me, and so they just showed up at worship because they heard I was there. And the folks from Hayshire had no idea that we were talking to transgendered people. I mean, they just embraced them and had a picnic and talked with them and all. And so at the next council meeting, I said, we probably need to do some education around transgender issues. They said, why? I said, because you had several that you worshiped with the other Sunday, and maybe it would do well to talk about that and understand who you were worshiping with and all that. And they were very open to that they were just accepting people and not even thinking about it. And then we're really glad to get some education to go along with that.
And I guess what I would tell you as a member of the O&A team, it's one thing to say we're welcoming and affirming, but your job doesn't stop with just shaking somebody's hand and say, we're glad you're here. You need to nurture and disciple people and make them an active part of what your ministry is all about. Because I think you're going to be amazed at some of the talent some of these other members of my community have that can really contribute to your overall ministry programs. It's exciting if you think about it, but open and affirming means more than welcome. It means nurture and discipleship. So anyway, we've got one more minute. And I'm going to use it this way. First of all, I'm going to thank Dietmar and Tom for spending their time with us. I think it was an excellent presentation. Dietmar, getting your experience with your trans son was absolutely amazing. And Tom, you're always good for giving us the pure poop from group on what the scientific and medical community has been looking at. And we want to thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us. At least I want to thank you for it. I told you before about a call to action, and I'm going to say it to you again. Show up and show out. You need to do that. If there's something going on at the state capitol that deals with LGBT issues, if there's going to be a demonstration in behalf of the Equality Act or whatever it may be, show up, because people need to see that there's numbers behind us, and the more people of faith that show up, we can have an opportunity perhaps to talk to the crazies and say, hey, I'm a Christian and I believe in loving everybody. You too, even though you may be thinking about things different than I am. So thank you, all of you, for showing up. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for your participation in Penn Central Conference. And let me pray with you. Most gracious and holy God, we come into your presence with thanksgiving, knowing full well that you're open and affirming for all of us. Not just for the LGBT community, but every single walking and living human being and those that have passed. We ask you, Lord, to be with us in all things. We ask that you continue to lead, guide, direct, and protect us. Praying these things in the name of your precious and only Son. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.